I honestly don't know why I never got rid of the old landline. I hadn't used it in years. Like most people, I just used my cell phone for everything, and eventually the landline became another piece of furniture. It sat on a small table in the hallway collecting dust. The service had been disconnected years earlier. I knew that for a fact because I'd canceled it myself after moving into the house. There wasn't any reason to keep paying for something I never used. The phone stayed because I never got around to throwing it away. If you've ever bought an older house, you know how that goes. You keep telling yourself you'll clean everything out next weekend, then 3 years pass. The reason I still think about that phone is because every few months, it would ring. Just once. Always after midnight. The first time it happened, I actually laughed. It startled me because I'd completely forgotten the phone even existed. I looked over at it while it rang. One ring, then silence. I figured maybe old electronics did strange things. Power surge, faulty wiring, something like that. I didn't think much of it. Then, about 3 months later, it happened again. Same phone, same single ring. This time, I checked the wall jack. Everything looked normal. Out of curiosity, I picked up the receiver. Nothing. Not static, not a dial tone, just silence. I hung up and went back to bed. Over the next year, it happened 4 more times. Always late at night, always one ring, never two, never during the day. There wasn't any pattern I could find. Sometimes 6 weeks apart, sometimes 4 months. Long enough that I'd completely forget about it before it happened again. One evening, I mentioned it to my brother while he was helping me move some furniture. He thought it was funny. He picked up the receiver himself. "No service," he said. Exactly what I expected. To prove his point, he unplugged the phone from the wall. He even held up the cable. Problem solved. I left it unplugged. A couple months later, just after 1 in the morning, the phone rang again. I remember sitting upright in bed because I knew I'd left it disconnected. I walked into the hallway. The phone was exactly where I'd left it. The cable was still lying on the floor, not plugged into anything. I stared at it for a few seconds after it stopped. I actually convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe my cell phone had made a similar sound. Maybe it had come from outside. That explanation worked until it happened again. This time, I was watching television in the living room, wide awake. The unplugged phone rang once. There's no mistaking that sound. Older landline phones have a very distinctive ring. If you've heard one enough times, you recognize it immediately. I walked over and picked it up. For the first time, I heard something. Not a voice, not breathing, just room noise. That's the only way I can describe it. It sounded like someone had accidentally answered a phone in another room. Very faint. No conversation, no television, no movement. Just the quiet sound of an empty room. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then the line went dead. I didn't tell anyone. Honestly, I figured nobody would believe me. Instead, I bought another phone. An old second-hand landline from a thrift store. I plugged it into the same wall jack. Months passed. Nothing. Then one night, around 12:30, the replacement phone rang. One ring. I answered immediately. Again, the same quiet room. No static, no interference, just silence that somehow didn't sound completely silent. I remember waiting nearly a minute before hanging up. Nothing changed. No voices, no clicks, nothing. After that, curiosity started getting the better of me. I asked a technician who was installing internet at the house whether an inactive phone line could somehow still receive calls. He shrugged. He said stranger things had happened with old wiring, crossed lines, electrical interference, faulty connections. His explanation made sense, until I mentioned the phone was unplugged the first time it rang. He stopped talking for a second. then simply said, "That shouldn't happen." Life moved on. The calls never became more frequent. If anything, they became less common. Maybe twice a year, sometimes only once. Eventually, I stopped worrying about them. They became another strange thing about the house, something I'd mention occasionally as an odd story. Then one weekend, a friend came over to help repaint the guest bedroom. For the sake of his privacy, let's call him Mark. We worked most of the afternoon, ordered pizza, watched the movie, and he ended up staying the night because it was raining too hard to drive home. Around 1 in the morning, the phone rang. Once. Mark looked toward the hallway immediately. He asked, "Do you still have a landline?" I laughed. Then I realized something. I'd never told him about it. He'd heard the ring too. We both walked over. The phone was sitting exactly where it always had, still unplugged. Mark actually picked it up before I could. He held the receiver to his ear for maybe 20 seconds, then quietly handed it to me. I asked what he heard. He just shrugged. The sound of a room. That's exactly how I'd always described it. Neither of us said much after that. He went home the next morning and we never really brought it up again. About a year later, I sold the house. During the final walkthrough, the new owner pointed at the old phone. He asked if I wanted to take it. I told him to throw it away. As far as I know, he did. That should have been the end of it. A few months after moving, I got a message from my old neighbor. He'd heard the house had been sold and wanted to know how I was settling in. We chatted for a while. Right before the conversation ended, he asked me something strange. He said, "Did you ever figure out the phone?" I stared at the message for a long time. I've never mentioned the phone to him. Not once. I asked what he meant. He replied that the previous owner, the man who lived there before me, used to joke about an old hallway phone that rang in the middle of the night. According to him, it had done it for years. Nobody ever found the fault with the wiring. Nobody ever figured out where the calls were coming from. I asked if he'd ever answered it himself. He said no, but the previous owner claimed he had. I asked what he heard. The neighbor's reply was only one sentence: the sound of an empty house. I still think there's probably a perfectly reasonable explanation. Old wiring, electrical interference, maybe even a faulty bell inside the phone. All of those sound more believable than anything else. But none of them explained why two different owners, years apart, described hearing exactly the same thing after answering a phone line that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder if whoever was on the other end was hearing the exact same silence that I was. I first caught wind of this story from a former coworker of mine. We aren't incredibly close these days, but we still make an effort to catch up every now and then. I'll use the name Ryan here to keep his personal business private. Now, Ryan isn't the type of guy to spin wild, exaggerated yarns. If anything, he's usually the first person in the room searching for a logical explanation when something weird happens, which is precisely why this particular story stuck with me. It wasn't that he claimed something utterly impossible had occurred. It was the fact that after months of trying, he could never manage to explain it away. At the time, Ryan was renting a modest 1950s-era house just outside Lexington, Kentucky. It was nothing fancy, just a quiet neighborhood where everyone tended to know everyone else. The local electrical grid, however, wasn't the most reliable. Every few months, typically during the sweltering summer days, the neighborhood would lose power. Sometimes it lasted for 15 minutes, sometimes an hour, but nobody ever thought much of it. One evening, around 11 p.m., the lights suddenly plunged into darkness. Ryan lit a couple of candles, grabbed his flashlight, and settled into the living room to wait for the grid to kick back on. About 10 minutes into the outage, a sound broke the silence. Someone knocked on his back door. It was 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not aggressive, just knock, knock, knock. Assuming it was just a neighbor checking to see if his power was out too, which wasn't unusual for the area, he walked into the kitchen and peered through the small window beside the back door. He didn't see a soul. The backyard was pitch black, but his flashlight beam cut all the way to the back fence, revealing absolutely nothing. He unlocked the door anyway and stepped onto the porch. No footsteps echoed, no voices drifted through the air, and there was no sound of the gate opening or closing. There was only a quiet neighborhood wrapped in a blackout. Shrugging it off, he went back inside and locked up. About 20 minutes later, the electricity returned, and he completely forgot about the incident. A couple of months passed before the next outage hit, occurring at almost the exact same time of night. Once again, Ryan sat in his living room waiting it out. And once again, about 10 minutes after the lights failed, those same 3 slow knocks echoed from the back door in the exact same rhythm. This time, he didn't open it right away. Instead, he stood by the window for nearly a full minute watching. Nobody appeared. When he finally opened the door, he found nothing, not even the faint audio cue of someone retreating. He went out to check the gate and found it still latched from the inside. A fence surrounded the entire backyard, leaving really only one way in or out. Hoping to ease his mind, he convinced himself it was probably just local kids playing a prank. It wasn't a flawless explanation, but it was certainly better than having none at all. Over the course of the next year, the pattern held ground. It didn't happen during every single blackout, but it occurred enough for him to notice a distinct trend. Whenever the power went out after dark, there was a chance the knocking would return. It was always 3 times, always at the back door, never at the front door or the windows, and never accompanied by a voice. Eventually, he brought it up to the elderly woman living next door. She listened to his story quietly before posing a single question. "The back door?" When Ryan nodded, her expression turned thoughtful. She admitted that she had heard the exact same knocking years earlier, though she had simply assumed it was teenagers before it eventually stopped. When Ryan asked if she had ever actually seen anyone, she told him no, it was always just the knocking. Rather than providing comfort, her answer only fueled his curiosity. The following winter, a severe ice storm triggered another outage, one that lasted much longer than the usual brief disruptions. Nearly 2 hours into the darkness, about 15 minutes after the failure began, the knocking returned. 3 slow knocks. Deciding to play it differently this time, Ryan chose not to answer. He stood completely still in the dark kitchen, waiting. Nothing happened for almost a minute, and then knock, knock, knock. 3 more identical sounds vibrated through the wood. He grabbed his flashlight and moved to the window, but still saw no one. He stayed there watching intently for 5 minutes as the backyard remained perfectly still. Then, without warning, the electricity surged back into the house. The floodlight, positioned directly above the back door, snapped on automatically, illuminating the entire space. The yard was completely, undeniably empty. Ryan walked outside immediately to investigate. The grass was damp from the melting ice, meaning that if someone had crossed the yard, they would have left visible footprints, yet there wasn't a single track to be found. He checked the gate, which remained latched from the inside, and noted that nothing looked disturbed. That was the first time Ryan truly admitted to himself that the situation genuinely bothered him. The very next day, he went out and purchased a battery-powered security camera, figuring that if it happened again, he would finally catch the culprit on film. It took almost 4 months for the next neighborhood outage to hit, but because the camera ran on its own battery pack, it kept recording right through the darkness. About 12 minutes after the lights failed, the 3 knocks sounded. Ryan stayed put, waiting until the power fully restored before he went to review the footage. The recording captured the back porch with total clarity. The door, the steps, the yard, and the gate. All were visible. Nobody had approached, and nobody had left. Yet the sound of the 3 solid knocks hitting the back door was clearly captured on the audio track. The porch had remained entirely empty the whole time. He replayed the clip over and over, searching for a glitch, but there was no gap in the recording and no distortion. It was just the sound. He even showed the footage to a few friends, but nobody could offer a definitive answer. One buddy suggested it might be tree branches, while another posited that the old wooden door was simply expanding and contracting due to temperature shifts. They were reasonable theories, except for two facts. There weren't any trees close enough to touch the house, and the knocks were flawlessly consistent. It was always 3 interval strikes, never 2, never 4. Ryan lived in that house for another 18 months, during which the knocking occurred 5 more times. The parameters never shifted. It was always during a nighttime power outage, always at the back door, and always within 10 to 15 minutes of the darkness setting in. Eventually, he moved away, figuring that his departure would finally close the chapter on the mystery. About a year later, however, he crossed paths with his old next-door neighbor while visiting the area. They chatted for a bit, and just before they parted ways, she casually mentioned that a new tenant had rented your old place. Then with an awkward smile, she asked, "They've asked you about the knocking yet?" Ryan replied that he hadn't spoken to them at all. The neighbor nodded and explained that only a few weeks after moving in, the new tenant came over to her house one morning. The very first thing they asked was whether the neighborhood kids were known for playing jokes during power outages. She told them no, and when she asked why they were curious, the tenant revealed that the electricity had failed the previous night. About 10 minutes into the blackout, someone had knocked on the back door 3 times. They looked outside immediately, but nobody was there. Ryan confessed that after hearing that, he never wanted to talk about that house again. To this day, he doesn't necessarily think anything supernatural was at play. He still maintains there's likely a perfectly ordinary explanation out there. Maybe someone discovered a clever way to slip through the surrounding yards without being detected. Maybe the sound echoed from a completely different source, or perhaps it was just a series of bizarre coincidences repeating themselves. I would probably lean towards one of those rationalizations myself if it weren't for the one final detail that Ryan could never quite shake. No matter the season, whether it was summer, winter, rain, or snow, the knocking never once occurred while the lights were on. It only ever happened after the neighborhood had been swallowed by complete darkness for several minutes. It was almost as if someone, or whatever was standing outside, wanted to be absolutely sure that nobody could see them. I don't live by myself anymore, but for a handful of years, I rented a modest little house just on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. It wasn't isolated or cut off from the world. It was simply a quiet, established neighborhood of older homes where the residents mostly kept to themselves. To be honest, that privacy was exactly what drew me to the place. My routine was incredibly predictable back then. I'd head home after work, whip up some dinner, unwind with a show for a bit, and then turn in for the night. Day in and day out, it was pretty much the same. The reason that house still occupies my thoughts from time to time isn't because of some dramatic event. No one ever forced their way inside, nothing was ever stolen, and I never once caught sight of an intruder roaming the rooms. But for a stretch of a few months, a pair of muddy boots kept inexplicably materializing right by my back door. And to this day, I have absolutely no idea where they came from. The very first time they appeared, I naturally assumed they belonged to me. I had just gotten back from visiting a friend who lived outside the city limits, where we'd spent the chunk of the afternoon trekking along a messy, rain-soaked trail. But when I stepped into the kitchen the following morning and spotted a pair of brown work boots resting on the mat by the back entrance, I froze. Looking closer, it hit me that they weren't mine at all. My own footwear consisted of black hiking boots, whereas these were weathered brown leather work boots of a completely different size and brand. My immediate thought was that a friend must have left them behind by mistake, so I fired off a few texts. Nobody claimed them. I even reached out to my landlord to ask if a previous occupant might have accidentally left them behind, but he just chuckled and noted that the property had sat entirely vacant for nearly a month before I signed the lease. Shrugging the whole thing off, I carried the boots out to the yard and set them right next to the trash bins. Figured whoever owned them might come back looking for them. By the time I woke up the next morning, they were gone, and I assumed the passerby or the owner had simply retrieved them. A couple of quiet weeks rolled by, and life resumed its usual rhythm. Then, on a Friday evening, I unlocked the back door after a long day at work and stopped dead in my tracks. The exact same boots were sitting right there on the kitchen mat, caked in fresh mud, occupying the precise spot where I'd first discovered them. I remember standing there desperately trying to convince myself that it had to be a different pair, maybe just a common style. To check, I picked one up and inspected the interior. There was a distinct small tear in the lining right near the heel, the exact same flaw I'd noted before tossing them outside the first time. They were without a doubt the very same boots. This time, I didn't leave them by the bins. I marched them straight out to the curb on trash collection day. The next morning, I watched from my front window as the garbage truck arrived and the workers emptied the bin just like they always did. I figured the problem was officially solved. Or so I thought. 3 nights later, I padded into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, and there they were again. Same fresh mud, same tearing inside the left heel, same everything. I actually let out a laugh, not out of amusement, but because my brain completely stalled trying to find an explanation that made any logical sense. I went around checking every single window and door, but everything was securely locked from the inside. Nothing else in the house had been disturbed. No valuables were missing. There was absolutely no sign of a break-in, just the boots. After that, I started paying much closer attention. I snapped a photo of them before moving them out to the garage. By the following afternoon, they had vanished from the garage entirely, only to reappear by the kitchen door 2 days later. It was always the back door and never anywhere else. Eventually, I brought it up to my next-door neighbor. He stared at me for a moment before asking, "Brown boots?" I laughed, thinking he was playing along with a joke, but his face remains completely serious. He told me he'd actually noticed them once before himself, not inside my house, but outside, right near the fence line that divided our backyards. He just assumed they belonged to some contractor working on the property. The strange part was that he'd only ever spotted them one time. I chose not to mention just how often they'd been showing up inside my kitchen. Determined to put the mystery to rest, I finally bought a small security camera to monitor the back entrance. I wasn't necessarily worried about a home invasion, I just wanted to stop torturing myself with questions. For nearly 3 weeks, the camera captured exactly what you'd expect: a few roaming neighborhood cats, a lone raccoon one night, and footage of me carrying out the trash. No boots appeared and no unusual activity whatsoever. Then came a Monday evening. I opened the back door after work, and there the boots sat. I felt a sudden spike of adrenaline. Finally, I was going to have answers on film. I went straight to the camera feed to review the footage. The playback looked completely normal and uninterrupted until about 3:40 that afternoon. Right then, for just under 2 minutes, the video completely froze. It didn't cut to black, and the file wasn't corrupted. The image simply locked in place. When the footage actively resumed, everything looked identical to before, except the muddy boots were now resting quietly on the mat. I meticulously combed through the recordings from the surrounding days, but found nothing, just that single, inexplicable pause. I even reached out to the camera's manufacturer's customer support line, and the tech explained that brief freezes can occasionally happen during background software updates or sudden memory errors. It sounded like a reasonable, technical explanation, but it still did absolutely nothing to explain how the boots got there. After a few more weeks, I simply gave up. I stopped moving them altogether because I was tired of playing the game. Whenever they showed up, I just left them where they were. Sometimes they'd stay for 24 hours, sometimes they'd vanish into thin air overnight, only to resurface a week later. They were always slick with wet mud, never dry, as if someone had just finished walking through the elements in them. Eventually, I moved to a completely different part of the city. I left the boots behind deliberately, choosing not to pack them with my things. When I handed the keys back to my landlord, I debated mentioning the phenomenon to him, but ultimately decided against it, because I didn't want to sound completely ridiculous. About 8 months down the road, I ran into the landlord by pure coincidence at a local hardware store. We exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, but right before we parted ways, he paused and said, "Out of curiosity." I turned back and said, "Yeah?" He offered a somewhat awkward smile and asked, "You didn't happen to leave an old pair of brown work boots behind, did you?" I felt a sudden cold drop in my stomach. I told him I didn't. He nodded slowly and explained that the new tenant had apparently discovered them sitting by the back door just a few weeks after moving in. The tenant had assumed they were mine, while the landlord had assumed they were the new tenant, so neither of them paid it much mind, until the boots vanished and then suddenly reappeared.
I wish I could tell you that someone eventually solved the riddle. Maybe it really was a neighbor pulling an incredibly elaborate, dedicated prank, or someone who had somehow kept a spare key to the property. Honestly, I'd prefer either of those human explanations over the alternative. But as far as I know, nobody was ever caught in the act, and the very last thing the landlord told me before he walked out to his truck has stayed with me ever since. He laughed nervously, looked back over his shoulder, and said, "I've owned that place for almost 15 years. He paused, gesturing to his truck, and added, "You're actually the third tenant who's mentioned those boots."